everyone, and welcome to the first ever recording of SILIP's new advocacy campaign, Libraries Are Essential, Scotland Stories. We're gathering together the stories of people from every corner of Scotland and beyond, from all walks of life, quite literally in this case, to share why libraries are essential to them. And we've got a very special interview to start us off. The Walking Library is an ongoing art project created by Misha and Heddon that seeks to bring together walking and books, literally following in the footsteps of a rich and resonant library history. Here's why libraries are essential to them. Enjoy. Dee and Misha, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I cannot wait to hear more about the Walking Library. And I wonder if we could start with you telling us its story, or its story so far, I should say, and what inspired you to create it.
Yeah, because it's lovely to be here. Thanks so much for inviting Misha and I. It's quite funny talking about the origin of the Walking Library, because it's quite a long time ago now. It's like a decade ago, and Misha and I have different starting origins. And Misha always says to me, that's not how it started. So I'm going to pass over to Misha, because this is the one opportunity where Misha gets to tell her side of the story.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think, yeah, they come together, but I was giving a talk in Edinburgh with Alec Finlay was on the panel, and he was talking about reading a poem on top of a mountain, and that made me think about what do people read in place, in situ, and what's important about that? What does that do? What does it add to the experience? And so I then put out an email to our Walking Artists Network, what people were carrying in their rucksacks that summer. It was a summer. And then Dee got in contact with me. I think this is how it goes. And there was a call out for proposals for the Sideways Festival, which was a festival that was traveling across Belgium. And Dee said, hey, why don't we create this project where we carry books, you know, create a library and carry books across Belgium. And Dee, I'll let Dee pick up there, because Dee also had her own connection to literature and walking. So
exactly. So the thing about, I mean, Misha and I, you know, we sort of co-originated this and we're collaborators on it. And so it's quite funny to hear our both different ways into this, like where did it start? So I was at that event that Misha talks about. And I also heard Alec Finlay talking about, you know, reading and walking. But I had been researching walking as a cultural practice for some time by this point, but so had Misha. And I knew that we had both come across references in books about walking, say in the Romantic period, Wordsworth, where he talks about carrying a book with him on his long walk. And so these two things come together, really. Misha's thinking about and hearing Alec talking about walking in place and wondering whether folk carry books now. And both of us looking at the history of walking practices and coming across these frequent repeated references to the book being a companion on a long walk, and wondering then about, well, I wonder if folks still carry books on walks. And so these things came together in this response to a call for artist commissions for, as Misha says, the Sideways Festival, which was an ecological environmental festival, all about walking, intending to walk back into existence the sort of walking pathways of rural Belgium, which would allow folk to stop using the car so much. And we thought, well, that would be brilliant to sort of think about, do folk take books for a walk? And if they do, what are those books? And if they don't, but this question might prompt them to think about that, what book would they take for a walk? And that's what we proposed for this festival, the question, what book would you take for a walk? And that was commissioned by Sideways Festival. And we asked that question. We got about 200 responses, with people giving us lots of suggestions. And then we managed, with a budget, to get about 100 of those, I guess. And with some volunteer librarians and 4 rucksacks, you know, very basic. We just, you know, carried those suggested books on this festival for 4 weeks as an itinerant library, really. And it was for the artists who walked the festival, but also members of the public who joined the festival. We set up libraries and temporary sort of library structures out in the open air for public to come and browse the books, and also to suggest and donate their own books to this library, which grew then as we walked across Belgium. So that was the first one, and that was 2012, Misha. So it is a decade ago.
Yeah. And we also, the thing that was special about that library in particular was because we were walking for a month with a community of artists, we actually ran it as a kind of lending library when we were walking. So people could, the artists that were walking with us could take them out, and we had date stamps, and we were, you know, performing these rituals of the libraries, and became interested in that. We became interested in the book cards, particularly. We might talk more about that later, but that was interesting to observe, like how people connected with the books that they chose to carry. And that question that we started with was really interesting. You know, what that kind of companionship, how people use them sometimes as pillows, sometimes to cover their face, but there was a real sense of, along that, something that, you know, I really connect with books and taking them on journeys and libraries themselves as places of solitude where you can kind of share that solitude. And that was something that was interesting in a social kind of, when you're traveling with a group of people, to find those spaces was really important.
And I guess just the other thing before we move on, Kristen, to say that was important was when we came up with this proposal, you know, what book would you take for a walk? I mean, Misha and I are both academic scholars as well as creative artists. And this is we think of this as a creative research project and an artwork. It's all of those things. And a library. It's all of those things at the same time. But we've been working on placemaking practices for, you know, many years independently of each other. And so we also saw this walking library as a way to explore the relationships between environment, reading, writing. You know, how do those three things work in relationship with each other? You know, what happens when you walk or read a book in a place? What happens to the book? What happens to the place? What happens to the walking? So it's been a really long-term research laboratory for us to think through relationships between literature, place, people, like who's walking with the books. You know, the books are in dialogue, the people are in dialogue, and they're all in dialogue with the place. So sort of rich dialogue working across all of those factors at the same time.
Oh, that's amazing. And I love the sense of storytelling that even comes out with hearing that history, because I think you've got your unique perspectives and then they weave together so beautifully, and a subtle Scottish origin there, even by way of Belgium, isn't there?
There is, yes, Edinburgh.
Yes, yes.
All roads lead to Edinburgh, and I shouldn't say that as a Glasgow-based person.
No.
I'll be in trouble.
You're dividing the Phillips audience right there, but we're a broad church. It's just incredible. And I think I get the sense that the library nature then it evolved very organically. This idea of not only people were bringing their own books, but they were keen to share. That was an integral part of it. And one of the things that I love hearing about the project is that each walk is an edition, and even the fact that you've called it a library, this beautiful, evocative literary language. What do you think it is about the idea of a library in particular that so perfectly encapsulates what the walking library has become?
Yeah, I mean, Misha and I can just chip in between us here. I mean, we've thought quite long and hard and written quite a bit about what a library is and what a walking library is then. And I guess at the very basis of this library is the idea that someone suggests a book that's good to take for a walk. And I think within that, there's that sense of sharing, generosity, things passing between hands. And in this case, feet, I guess. You know, these books are made to be walked. We laugh about that. So there's something there about knowledge passing through and sharing. There's something in the nature of a library that's about, it's free. That's the other thing. It costs nothing. These books are there to be borrowed. They don't cost anything. And, you know, we take them out for a walk. There's never a cost to that. People join us on the walk and we share the learning. And we were thinking at the start really about the emergence of the public library as a democratic, you know, accessible space for, you know, learning, knowledge creation, knowledge sharing. And so at the heart, I guess that was one of the things that inspired us with the walking library, was to think of that as a generous space of sharing and giving and passing on. Some of the libraries are based entirely on donations of books. so there's nothing, that's such a gift at the heart of that, where books are donated and then passed on again. So that in a sense is like the library, isn't it? These books, you have your library card, and it's remarkable, isn't it? You can walk into a library and take these books and it just costs you nothing, and you can have weeks of pleasure, and also someone else has read them before you, and someone else will read them after you. I think that's lovely. Misha, is there anything else you wanted to add there? Because we've sort of talked quite a bit, haven't we, about the mobile library form as well. Maybe you want to talk about the mobile library form.
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking, is that the other aspect, and it's actually that kind of portability of the book and its evolution historically, with Manutius' invention of the libelli portatile, that in the 16th century, that kind of made that possible for books to be shared and to move, to be taken on a journey and travel. And so that's something that's really interesting. And for me, I'm really interested in digital technologies, and yet this project is so much about the actual book. But it is kind of one of the first mobile media in that sense, with Manutius' invention. And so that's something that's really interesting, because it's what gives it that sociality. But I think it's also, it compels, there's something about a book that compels you to want to share it. It's not something that you necessarily hold on in the way that when, books were first printed, they were so valuable, and you these massive things that you carried and you kept to show your status in the world. But, now it's more about that sharing. And the other thing is the kind of accoutrement and those practices of the library, like mentioned before, the loan card. These were things that we saw as opportunities too, to kind of, I guess, bring to the more to the surface that aspect of the library that's so interesting. So, each of those cards holds this data, that shows us the connections between people, the value to readers, how often they're read, their travels in time. So we use that as a space where we invite people to share that story of their connection to it and why they've suggested it with the particular question that we've asked. And so those are tucked in our books, so that people can see that story. And so it's a story within a story that kind of unfolds with the library.
And I think
the other thing I would say, I was just going to mention the Dewey Decimal System that we developed. Our first library was actually, we worked with a librarian to give them a Dewey Decimal Code. But then once we kind of took them on the road with us on the green paths of Belgium, we invented our own, because we didn't know really, we weren't experts at doing decimal. And that became interesting because it's the kind of curation of that library from those suggestions and donations. We could start to do some analysis, I guess, of what it was that people were suggesting, and started to create our own categories for them. And that became something else.
I suppose it's worth just, we just must say this, like, we are not librarians, we are very amateur. And so sitting with the Dewey Decimal going, this doesn't seem to fit any of these categories. I mean, Dewey Decimal is quite tricky anyway, because of course it's expanded, but we're like, a lot of the books are art books, they're very particular, singular. It's like, where does that fit? It's not any of these classifications. So we had fun with that, really, thinking we're doing this quite badly, but we're embracing that. Kirsten, we're also aware that libraries are much more than just, places for lending books, that they gather folk into them and things happen there. And so we were very keen to think of our mobile library, because it is a mobile library. We were keen to think of it also as a sort of intangible space, in a way that folk can come into. There's no building there, but there's a sort of invisible structure of gathering and exchanging. And so we would have writing groups, we'd read to each other, and I think of my local library is Hill Head Library in Glasgow in the West End, which I really love. And they have, young babies and mothers, or parents groups, young babies and parents groups, children and parents groups. And you hear the kids being read aloud to. And in some senses, we replicate that, because that's what we do in our walking library. We share readings. We walk and we select extracts from our books that we want to share with folk. So, for example, we're walking by an urban farm in Belgium, and someone happens to have a book about, urban farming, and they stop and they read a chapter for a bit, a paragraph from that. And we all learn then a bit about urban farming. That's a quite quick exotic example, but you get the drift. or someone's got a book of poetry, and it seems to fit with the sort of atmosphere of where we are, and they stop and they say, I've just read this poem, it absolutely resonates, let me share this with you. So there's sort of, I guess, resonances of the public spirit of the public library there, where knowledge is just passed and circulates, and there's no hierarchy of who knows what, who knows more. You know, what we've got with us for companionship are ourselves and our books, and that's what we pass between us. I grew up in a very rural environment in the west coast of Scotland, and the library was a mobile library on wheels that would come once a week, and you know, what a thrill, the library's here. So they've been really important in my life, really, from a child, and sort of tapping back into that form of the mobile library, in this case a pedestrian library. You know, I think there's something quite autobiographical about that. And then Misha and I know there are loads of mobile libraries. There's the donkey library, you know, the biblioburo, which makes sure that books get, you know, that children and, you know, marginalized communities get access to books. There's the bike libraries, you know, there's the converted car libraries, there's the boat libraries in Finland, Norway. And so I suppose we think about libraries in that wider sense, I guess, of getting books to people and bringing people to books.
Oh, it's just amazing, and our members will be so happy to hear that shout out for mobile libraries as well, because they're we actually have a mobile libraries day now in November, so they're very dear to our hearts.
I love it.
Another one that actually comes to mind is Eleanor Roosevelt's Horseback library too. And I know that we're going to touch on feminism. Nobody will be surprised to know that I'm going to steer us towards feminism in a few seconds, but that really interesting balance between the tangible and the intangible, and that's something that our own libraries are having to face at the moment, because ironically, I think during the lockdowns they brought in so many digital innovations, it really was second to none, that we're now having to reassert the value of the physical space and the connections that can only be formed in there, as it sounds like you've experienced as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting, that shift, isn't it? But what comes back, and it might just take a bit of time for folk to realise that there's much to be gained. I mean, Misha's, you know, as she said, you know, digital is her interest, and there's, you know, definitely masses to be gained by that, and we've learnt masses about access through the digital. But there's also something, isn't there, about that being in a space together and the serendipity of that. Many folk have asked us why our library is not just carried on a Kindle or, you know, or a digital device. Like, why are we humping heavy books around? Like they're weighty, you know, they take effort. Yeah. That's partly why, in a way, like we want to feel the weight of the book. But there's something about the tactility. Go on, Misha, sorry.
Yeah. I was going to say, yes, that the materiality of it, and the fact, you know, I mean, like the marginalia, those, you know, the loan cards, the book cards, the stories within that, all those kind of, yeah, I think for me, it was interesting, what do we lose with the digital and the serendipity, as you say? I mean, that's, I think, so important. We're kind of
the browsing.
I know, I'm craving that.
Exactly. And the browsing
doesn't give you that.
Like, here's a book, The Public Life of the Street Pigeon. This is from the Walking Library for a Wild City, which was made for Glasgow in 2018 as part of the Commonwealth Games. And, you know, this is a very, very popular book. You know, we invite folk to browse our shelves and pick what they want to walk with. And we all pick what we want to walk with, and then we walk together. Maybe a group of 15 of us, each carrying a book in ourselves, and we walk as a little group. This one is always taken out, because what's not to love about the secret public, you know, the public life of the street pigeon? And just to, you know, just to maybe demonstrate what Misha's talking about the cards that are carried, like this is a very short one, but inside this book you can see we've got a little pocket, Walking Library, and in this pocket is the card that tells us what it is and who suggested it and why. This is a very short reflection. This was suggested by Heddon, and he says on it, "Another wee belter," because he suggested more than one book. But if I just flick open this book, you know, what falls out but a pigeon's feather, because someone's put a pigeon's feather in it. And then at another point in the book, if I can find it, remarkably, this book was walked in Edinburgh this summer, there's the shell of a pigeon egg. This is new, Misha's not seen that. So this book is literally carrying the traces of its walk through different cities, and it's been walked in Edinburgh and Glasgow so far. Do you know, and that's lovely. Now, you can't get that on your iPad or your Kindle or your digital. Well, there's another one. You know, this book's filled with pigeon feathers. And really remarkable stories about this, the public life of the street pigeon. You know, it's a fantastic read.
Goodness, it's really become a piece of art in its own right then, but one
Totally. And an archive. Do you know, if you talk about the tangible, like that's an archive now, isn't it? Of like what folk have passed by and seen and found and marked their, like they're marking the page that they read as well. So you kind of know where they've been in the book as they've been walking. So that was just one that I had to hand there handily.
Oh, well, it's an incredible one. Amazing. And let me just say as well, do not worry about the Dewey Decimal doubts. It's actually quite a controversial topic in library land these days. It has its detractors, certainly. It has its issues. So if you're bringing a bit of creativity to it, that's quite often no bad thing. And in fact,
we enjoyed it, so that's good to know we're all right doing that.
Yes, definitely, we're all right. Yes, definitely safe to do that. And I actually loved when I was reading one of your articles, the classifications or the different areas that came up. I feel like there could be a new Myers-Briggs test, you know, the different ways that people approach this, because some people are like, walking as a biographical genre, walking in fiction, the cultural context, like the pigeon in the public life, practical books and the weight being an issue. Books about how humans inhabit the world. And I think this is my favorite, books that would benefit from being taken out for a walk. I think there'll be librarians watching this, looking at their shelves thinking, some of these need some fresh air. I'm maybe going to take them out and get a wee bit of air to them. And
I think you should lead a walk on that. We had fun with that, thinking that, didn't we, Misha, about like what book would you take to wild it? I mean, this is the Walking Library for a Wild City, which is one of the editions. I mean, we've probably made about 10. And, you know, one of the questions was, well, what book would be made wild by taking it off its shelf and out of the door? And what happens, you know, when you put it in the landscape? It's words all fly off the page in unexpected ways, you know, I guess.
And particularly with walking, the kind of sense of breath, and, you know, when you actually, we did with Sideways, we did a lot of walking and reading at the same time. And that was quite interesting to kind of, I think the performance of the reading is really important to the walking library. You know, as Dee described, when people select a place, or they suddenly think, oh, that's the perfect place to read this, or, you know, but that sense of the body connecting, the breath, the pace, the rhythm of the writing, the rhythm of the language. Basha was a favorite for that, for reading together. And it also helped us kind of, you know, to survive, I think, long kilometers of walking together when you're exhausted. I found that really important to kind of companions, that somebody reading to me was just such a gift to help me get through the journey. Yeah.
That's incredible. And I think that's something that it's such a kind of, in human history, it's such an innate kind of need to have that sense of storytelling and connecting. And it's probably been lost. People are probably seeking it in podcasts and things like that, but to have it live, and you're right, it strikes me that people quite often bring poetry, then must be a particularly kind of valuable category, because it seems to me that not only is so much of it inspired by nature, because I did think what would be the book I would bring on the walk, and I've been greedy and I've taken two. What
have you got?
So my synopsers were like, oh my gosh, she's talking about that woman again. These are both Kathleen Raine books, because she was very much inspired by nature with her work, and this one's quite light, so that's
very good.
And then
is that who you're dressed up as?
Yes, technically, which all that means is I've got my hair up rather than down, because I tend to act dressed like I'm out of the 50s anyway.
That's good. So that's your World Book Day. This is you, and these are the books. That's great. So you can put that.
I know that you've got one up your sleeve as well, Dia.
So what's the second book called?
This one, so this was written, now this was when she was married, it's Kathleen Madge. We don't like him, but that's by the by. The World of Living Green. So this was actually a children's book. The first half is plants in the real world, and then it's plants in the imagined world.
Oh, lovely.
Oh, love that.
That's lovely.
So one to inhabit, and I can just imagine being on one of these walks, even if it was flowers and you know, in between pavement cracks. I think it would just
exactly that.
It's so much, and there's such a history of this, isn't there? Like, I know that you touched on the romantics, and I had no idea that John Keats had made his way all the way from the Lake District up to here in Scotland with Dante's Divine Comedy. There's such heritage that you're tapping into here.
But that's an odd, you sort of think now that's an odd book, isn't it? Why would you take Dante's Divine Comedy? So in a way, I think what's probably different about ours is that when you say to folk, what book would you take on a walk? It's not always the case. We've got some really interesting suggestions, but many folk think of books to do with walking or books to do with the environment, particularly for a wild city. I mean, the question was, what book would you take to, to find the wildness in the city? And so many of the books were about, urban nature returning, or the apocalypse, nature making its comeback because the humans have destroyed Earth and the Earth will survive without the humans anyway. So the sort of theme, so you sort of go, well, what was he thinking of when he took Dante's Divine Comedy? I presume he just wanted to read it. There's just a sort of practicality around that, like it's time and space to read. So I think probably the responses to our questions are a bit more focused really on like the place that we're inviting folk to think about, where they might walk and read. And Misha, we did find that poetry, I mean, if you think about the sideways one, when we were literally reading and walking, I think we did find that actually probably the best thing to literally walk and read with is the poem, because the pacing, the meter of it lends itself to the footfall in a way. And it's quite a good way to learn a poem by walking it, I think. Misha.
And I was thinking also of poems. I'm trying to think if it was a Scottish poet.
Thomas A. Clarke. Thomas A.
Clarke, one of my favorites. I think reading Thomas A. Clarke's descriptions of landscapes in his poems in Belgium was really interesting, that kind of contrast of landscapes. But then sometimes you've had these wonderful synchronicities where he'd be describing something and you look out and you think, well, that actually perfectly aligns and describes the quality of light that I'm experiencing right now or something. And there's something about that answers the question for me about what is it about it that, it kind of attunes your senses in a particular way, regardless of whether or not it is about that place. Although I love taking books about a place that I'm traveling. And that was one of the things that, I think it's really interesting with the project, but also that kind of comparison or just the evocative language that a writer will use to describe place helps me to appreciate and think of my own, ways of perceiving and understanding and describing, articulating a place. So there's something that, deepens that sense. And it also kind of takes you, not out of place. That's the thing. It's often, think about a book as an escape. And I think for me, my particular personal connection with books was exactly that. I grew up in Mississippi and in a family that did not read, but I devoured books. I would read a book a day. And so libraries were essential because there was no way I would otherwise be able to do that. But I used to read up in a tree, always in a tree. And there's something about being in the tree and reading that came together for me.
And of course, and as we know, the tree, of course, is what the book is made of.
Yes, exactly.
We're holding a tree every time we hold the paper book, so we quite like that. The thing about, I guess, walking in poetry as well is it's sort of a bit easier because you can stay with the line, you can just repeat the line. Reading sentences can be quite hard to follow, but I'm thinking of the Thomas A. Clarke line that goes, once again, for the first time, morning. And you can really just pace that out repeatedly, and it gives every time that moment of pleasure because it's such a brilliant little, 3 lines. Once again, for the first time, morning. And I remember very clearly walking with that line and that book in Belgium, really, just repeating that over and over with my paces, the meter of it. So whereas following a philosophical thought while walking is a bit more difficult, like keeping the line in mind, the thread, the flow of the thread of thinking is slightly more challenging because you are immersed in a landscape and you do need to be a little attentive to things around you, like roads, cars, people, potholes,
And feathers, of course.
And feathers, exactly.
Yes.
Pigeons fly in from all directions. Anyway,
that makes me think of the walker on Sideways who was carrying Rousseau and read, which was interesting. It was kind of she was often reading it while walking, which I found really interesting. Very slow, always at the back. And I think that's interesting because Rousseau, of course, would walk to think, And she was carrying Rousseau to, perhaps to understand and to engage with Rousseau in a different kind of concentrated way. So
walking to think with or through Rousseau.
To think with. And I think that's another thing that's really interesting, that kind of books as conversation partners, so it's like they offer that kind of other perspective, in a dialogue with you. So.
Exactly.
Definitely, there's a sense of all these conversations happening at once. There's the conversation between the reader and the author, between the readers who are sharing the experience, and between you and your space as well. It's such a profound thing. It's incredible. And I know that we've touched a lot then on the sense of being in a space and how that's integral to the whole experience. And one of the things we really want to bring out in our campaign is the link between libraries and sustainability. We're seeing very much so our library service is really leading the way. Like Inverclyde and Western Isles, they were both part of COP26 climate beacons, and places like the National Library of Scotland, they're doing tons to tackle misinformation about climate. Do you think in your experience of this project, the libraries then have something unique to contribute to climate action and how we learn to inhabit the world in new ways, perhaps?
Well, it's a really good question, Misha, because it's not an angle we've gone down, which is, well, when I say it's not an angle, we've not had a discussion around that. But what is true is that the Walking Library started from that environmental prompt in Belgium, which was about inviting folk to leave their cars to do more local walking. So it's very, origin story at heart. It is about actually thinking about our impact on the planet, and to walk is much less impactful than to drive. And of course, the thing about the library and the walking library is that these resources are shared. It's not about private ownership, as Misha said. So, in principle and in ethos, the nature of, shared goods, accessible and free for everyone, is very socialistic principle, I guess, isn't it? It's not about private ownership. It's not about status. It's about sharing the wealth of literature and learning and knowledge equitably, irrespective of whatever your position or status or economic power or unpower is in the world. That library is open and there for you, and we're all equal in that space. So if we think about, I guess, sustainability and the climate crisis, it's a question of justice and equity. It's a question of who is most impacted by the climate crisis that's already here. Folk are already at the sharp end of climate crisis. And really, I guess, in tackling climate crisis, you've got to tackle social justice. And I think the library is a beacon of social justice, which is, why I would advocate so strongly for the presence of libraries to be sustained. They are free places of learning. They are free places of resources that allow folk to understand the world, their place in it, and the actions that they can take to make a better world, which includes a world that is more sustainable and more just and more equitable for everyone. So it feels like a model to me of equitability, of equality, really, of equity, and a model of social justice. So on that alone, it's a bit of a flagship, isn't it? For how can the world be made better? Well, actually, by sharing the resources more equitably. That's one answer. Misha.
Yeah, and I think, well, there's a few things there. I mean, I think it's interesting that so many libraries are being, the physical books thrown out for the digitization, and yet there's so many commercial interests in that digitization, and so what gets left out? And if we lose that knowledge, I mean, that's critical to climate action, is this knowledge. It's, libraries are one way of holding that distant time and that distant knowledge and cultural knowledge, environmental knowledge of place. And if we lose that, and digital is ephemeral. It's not, we think about it as something that's going to be with us, but it costs a lot of resources to maintain, just as it does building the architecture to hold the libraries themselves. But that circulation, I mean, I think that's what's interesting, is we can't let go of the kind of physical books, and perhaps, it's that circulation amongst people that keeps that. I see so many more and more books pop in. Those little free libraries outside people's houses, which I find really interesting. Like here, I just see them all the time. And I think that's interesting, if there are ways in which people will start to invent to keep, because we're not going to do away with them. I think they're like one of my most precious, my library. But it's not, the digital, it is just as ephemeral, and it costs just as much in terms of resources. So once we kind of come to terms with that, perhaps we start to think differently about how we hold knowledge and keep it.
And circulate it. I guess the other thing I was thinking about climate change, I guess, is, and sustainability in libraries, places within that, is it's really important that there are multiple perspectives, and I think libraries offer that. There's not one book on climate change. I mean, there's not one answer to climate crisis. There's not one solution. There are many, many perspectives, and they're all there to be engaged with and critiqued, as much as any other in a way. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Kirsten, but of course, there is a curation to a library, like the librarian presumably selects some of the stock, and I don't know what drives those decisions. I should say the walking library takes anything that's offered to it. So it doesn't select, it's very open horizontally in that way. In terms of like what it carries. But I also think, Kirsten, that if I was to ask the library to stock a book, it would attempt to do that for me, Hillhead Library.
Yes, that's right. So I love that concept of horizontality, if I'm not making up a word right there, because this is actually a really key pressing issue that we're dealing with in libraries at the moment, that kind of the myth of the neutral, and looking at historical collections and who they were shaped. We had a wonderful webinar last week with Amina Shah, who we're lucky enough to have as Philip's president and the National Librarian.
And amazing.
When we're discussing where even the National Library's collections came from, very often it is rich, white, older, wealthy men, and that has shaped it to an extent. But what they're now finding is what they call hidden collections. The ephemera, the material quite often is there, the stories are there, and it's up to us to have the courage, have the effort, and then also have the resources to raise them to the light. It's such it's very much it's a question that a lot of librarians are asking themselves too at the moment.
Exactly. So that is really interesting, isn't it? So our collections are prompted by the question that we ask, like, what book would you give to a woman walking? Like the books in response to that are very different to the question that asks, what book would you take to find wildness in the city? Of course they are. So our collections are really prompted by, a thinking around, a particular commission or space or place. What is this library's job? What is this library's job? In one instance, the library's job is to attune folk more to the wilderness of the urban space. In another one, is to attune folk more to the fact that actually often different libraries can be very gendered. Certainly in the world of walking, there's still a predominance of books written by and about men historically and contemporaneously, in current times. And so, these questions prompt for us different collections, but I don't know what the question is that drives a public library about what's in it. What's the question that fills your library up with certain types of books and not others? So I don't know enough about librarianship to know the answer to that.
Oh, well, definitely. I don't think we have one answer either. But what I would say to people is, it is a kind of, the more you use it, the more you interact with us, there's nothing that will make any library worker happier than knowing that somebody wants that book. So you think, if we have those connections in a community, if people ask us, you're right, we do have kind of really elaborate interlibrary loan systems. Certainly all the local authorities are part of a cluster. So one of the things that we always laugh at in a webinar and an online learning, if somebody can't quite remember a stat or they're trying to think of a title, you give them a minute, in the chat box there it appears, they cannot resist. It's just ingrained in all of us. So that definitely it's a kind of ongoing debate, but it's such an interesting one. I think it will be worthwhile to continue reflecting on it. I'm struck when you mentioned the walking library for women walking. People will be like, right, here she goes again, she's ticked off Kathleen, here we go with the feminism. I think there used to be mine now, but that sounded like such an interesting one, because I know that your London edition, you traced the route of suffragettes, and it sounds like you were kind of looking in vain quite often for statues of women along the walk. Do you feel there's a feminist component to what you're doing and what the issues are coming up when you look at your collections? And
Misha and I took sort of different walks. Misha's in Australia, and she's coming in from Australia in her morning, our evening.
Yes, thank you for that, Misha, by the way.
Misha can talk about what happened in Australia, but this walking library was prompted by an exhibition called Walking Women, which was specifically meant to like focus on where are the women in walking art, who's writing about walking, who's left out, who's marginalised, and thinking about then that context of walking and gender, I guess, prompted a sort of wider thinking around walking in place. And the fact that, of course, the suffragettes marched en masse to become visible in the push for, the vote for women, that was a really important, vital tactic, really, that there was hundreds of thousands of women marching together through the streets of London and elsewhere, demanding suffrage and making very visible and vocal their presence and right to demand that, I guess. And so in London, we did re-follow those footsteps, really, in thinking about the relationship of women and walking in place. And we decided that we would, for this walk, we would stop wherever we came across a statue of or to a woman, and that's where it became very difficult, Kirsten. There are literally there are none. So that was a shocking reminder, really, of just how gendered place is. I mean, if there's nothing neutral about a library, there's nothing neutral about place and space. And it's very classed, raced, bodied, and gendered, really. So we walked to Parliament Square, where, of course, the suffragettes would have stood and protested. And, there's like 11 statues to men around Parliament Square, none to women at all at that point. So there's something there about like bringing together, inspiring books that inspire women, books that are written by women about women walking, books that are inspiring women to walk or tell women's histories of walking in place, and then walking them into place that still remains relatively gendered in the terms of who owns and who has access to public space, I guess. And Misha, you probably have more nuance to add about Australia there, because there's different histories and sort of oppressions.
Yeah, well, the walk that I led here traced the women's petition, the suffragettes petition in Victoria. They all over Australia. I think there were these door-to-door campaigns, walking door-to-door to get signatures for the right to vote. And it was interesting in doing that. We became very conscious. We were walking within a kind of neighborhood, houses, suburbs. And so it was really quite easy to imagine women walking up to the door. And at that time, to walk up to the door as a woman to ask for the woman of the house to kind of sign a petition, potentially, the person opening the door being the man of the house who may not have been in favor. We were really struck by how courageous they must have been, and it inspired us. And so that kind of inspiration that Dee, mentioned was really strong in the walk. And I think that's one of the things that I think about the library, and particularly that one, is the kind of stories of adventure and the journey in the library of the things that women have achieved and done, and that really does embolden you. And I think that's something I've definitely found, that, for instance, one of my favorite kind of autobiographic is Ellen MacArthur's autobiography of sailing the Vendée Globe, and how she breaks the canon of all the stories that men have written about their journeys, and, holding, this kind of heroic, mythical being, and she's just so human, and I think to kind of have that human perspective on that walk that we had was just really profound. And while it was kind of the subtext, it was important part of the walk and structure of the walk, but we were also reading to one another. Someone read a book about women and environment and designing environment, and so I can't remember the title of that book, but that was really interesting while we were standing in front of a engineering firm's office and just thinking about how, this particular author was thinking about how women can shape, the environment. That was really, kind of those things, along with the kind of walking this past, steps of these women who really shaped the future of women's ability to be a part of government, a part of political life. So yeah, and the other thing I guess I'd say about the women's library, so something that was different about that was that we really, with that library, made an effort to kind of shift the percentage. I mean, it was interesting with our first library, I think it was, what, Dee, was it 75% of the authors were male, yeah. Which is the classic, percentage, right? 75-25,
libraries are 75% women. Our CILIP membership is as well. So, that's so
right. So
that's really interesting.
It's really interesting. So the first walking library, which simply said, what book would you take for a walk? 75% of the books suggested were written by men.
So we shifted that the other way with the women's library, which were all, donated to the library as well, with that particular collection.
Exactly, they were sent in, like literally sent in to us, so, and it's a fantastic, which is now at Glasgow Women's Library. So that's the other thing to
wonderful.
Say.
They're good friends of ours at CILIP. That's wonderful.
Yeah, they are. So it's probably a thing to say that when we create an actual, library, walking library, we donate it on to an organisation, either the organisation that might have commissioned the walk, or just someone that we think would provide a good home for it, because the intention is that the books continue to circulate. So the walking library for women walking is with Glasgow Women's Library.
Oh, I can't wait to find one on their shelves now. I'm going to
and find and they've just dispersed it across their library, so it's not like siphoned out. So you'll find it with one of the book cards in it. That's how you'll identify it. It might even still have our bad category Dewey Decimal. They don't use Dewey Decimal, of course.
No, they don't. See, he's on his way out. You guys are a bit worried.
Exactly. So that's quite fun. I think the other thing though to say about that library, Misha, is that it was our walks are open to anyone. We don't go, oh, you've got to be a woman to go on this walk with us. But as it turned out, to no surprise, 99% of the folk on the walking library for women walking walks were women. And so actually we were really physically mirroring those suffragette walks by being a group of women visibly walking through the streets. And that in itself attracts a bit of attention. You are present and visible, and you're all carrying books, which raises the ante even further. Like, what on earth are those group of women doing walking through London, stopping to read Virginia Woolf's Street Haunting, not in search of a pencil, but, in search still of equity. So the physical presence of walking bodies on a group like that, I have to say, probably it is mostly women that come on the walks, but that was the most stark percentage, I think, from all of the editions around that, really.
Oh, it's so interesting to hear. And I bet even the books, they're presented in different ways. One of the things that really infuriates me is that I think if a man writes about a concept, it's given a capital letter. It's like he writes about grief as affects us all, whereas a woman, she's writing about her grief and her mother, and it's all, everything is just shrunken into this domestic sphere. So I think that is so powerful about you putting these boots on the ground, as it were, and books in the world as well.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it, as well? And even if it is about the domestic, it's then taken out into the world, literally. It's made public. So like we take, even if the book was about a domestic context, it's like taken into public and walked, isn't it? And of course, it's that sort of the personal is political, isn't it? Like even the domestic is political and public. Like there's nothing private about the domestic. It's a very publicly informed and conditioned and managed space in some senses.
I literally cannot wait to take my books out for a walk now. This is so inspiring. Now, I mean, I could talk to you both all night or all morning, Misha, in your case, but I know that I'm very conscious of the time. So what is, perhaps you could tell us what's next for the Walking Library, and if any of our viewers in Scotland's libraries want to get involved, have an idea of how they could contribute, what would be best? Can they contact you? What would you suggest?
Yeah, we have a blog site called the Walking Library Project. So maybe I could, send some information around that, which has all the editions that we've made. And also I should say that each library has a library catalogue. So you can download this from our website. So this is the catalogue of books for the Walking Library for a Wild City. And you see in this catalogue everything that's been suggested, the title of it and why it's been suggested. So it's a really good, lovely resource. So the Walking Library for women walking, you'll see all the books that were donated there and why, and who donated them. So that's there as an ongoing resource, really, which also publicises when we're doing walks. And folk can just drop us an email or get in touch, because we continue to add suggestions, if not literal physical books. The last library we made was last year for the National Forest in the Midlands, so walking library for forest walks. And we haven't got a commission for another one yet, but it will be on our website whenever we do. However, we are doing a residency in Italy. I don't know if you want to talk about Colomachia, Misha, which is our next walking library adventure, and it's a really new adventure for Misha and I, actually. And we haven't been in the same country for years, so we're going to be in Italy together, if nowhere else. Misha, do you want to say something about wild places?
Yeah, so that's with the Museum of Loss and Renewal in Colomachia, which is in the Molise region. And I believe that the applications for that are still open, and they're finishing, I think, the 28th of March, the application process. So it'll be a chance to spend a week with us walking, and for artists, people, well, of all disciplines, really, anybody who's engaging with site-based practices, geographers, librarians who want to take books for a walk, and to develop, I guess it's using our methods and practices as prompts to for people to create their own work. So a space for people to create work. We did a digital version of it last year during the pandemic. We went online and explored different methods of doing that and sharing walks remotely. Created an audio walk. So still looking at ways to kind of digitally, that, is something that really interests me. But in Colomachia, very excited to be really immersed in a place and in a very particular community that's looking at really how they can be more sustainable and resilient as a community, and live with the forest. I mean, it's an interesting kind of history of how that forest, its village is really surrounded by the forest, and the forest was kind of pushed back to make way for the community. But as the community has shrunken and changed, and new migrants coming in, the forest has become to rewild itself. And so that's part of the project, is kind of looking at that relationship with the forest, and what needs to kind of be the pathways to kind of, like Belgium, kind of maintaining these kind of ancient pathways through the forest. So it's a kind of different experience for us, thinking about how that kind of pedagogical space, and also the kind of residency, like Sideways, was this kind of durational work in a way, going back to that kind of space and spending time with people. So we're very excited about that, to get back together.
Definitely. No, and I think some of our librarians will be grabbing their passports. I think they will want to walk with you for sure. Oh, it sounds so incredible. And I just love how it has evolved, and it's continuing to evolve within each walk and as a project, and learning from everyone that's involved as well. It's just incredible. I think I won't forgive myself if I was just going to say to you, may we please see your World Book Day costume before.
So I think to end, right, we should have a little reading from the Walking Library. And this is the Walking Library for a Wild City. And I was told that it was World Book Day, as I know it is, because it's all over Twitter and social media. So this is my World Book Day contribution. And now this is a book called I Want to Be a Cowgirl. I don't know whether Misha knows this book, because this is a favourite of someone who comes on quite a lot of walking library walks in Glasgow when we do them. And she picked up this book each time, because actually she does wear a cowgirl hat. So this is I Want to Be a Cowgirl, and I can just read the card actually from this one. So this is I Want to Be a Cowgirl by Jean Willis and Tony Ross, and it was suggested by Anita Clark and Bonnie. And they say, we love the spirit of the girl in the story and how she's able to imagine the Wild West into her city surroundings. She is brave and knows what she wants to do. And it's a fantastically illustrated children's book, which sort of, the cactus and high-rise flats together. So let me just read a very little. I don't want to be a good girl. Good girls have no fun. I can't play quiet games indoors. I love the rain and sun. I don't want to be a girly girl who likes to sit and chat. I just want to be a cowgirl, Daddy. What's so wrong with that? And so she goes off and she becomes the cowgirl of the whatever wild west that she's living in. And there she is, you know, frolicking at the end with her cowgirl hat and her Stetson and her chaps. And who doesn't want to be a cowgirl, Kirsten? Do you know?
Oh, I do, and I certainly do now, and I'm very jealous of your hat as well, Dee.
Yeah, exactly. You know, good old. Actually, it's Canadian. It's probably made in Mexico, but it was from Canada, so it's not quite hitting the Texan vibe. But anyway,
the trick, and I think it's got that well-behaved women rarely make history vibe to it, which we just adore over here as well.
Exactly. So we thank Anita and Bonnie for that suggestion, you know, and that's
Thank
from
you.
Loch Library for a Wild City. So if you like that book, you can get further details on our website. Should I take the hat off now? I do feel slightly self-conscious, or should I keep it on until the end of the broadcast?
Go with your
Looks
instinct.
great.
I mean, it's working from here, yeah.
I mean, I have to say this is also part of the costume, right? You recognise that this was like set costume. The checkered shirt was part of the costume. Right. So that's as we've done World Book Day, and it's very, you know, we must support reading and we must support libraries. They are essential.
That's so well said, and just everything you've shared with us tonight. I think thank you so much for all the support you're giving to the campaign, all these ideas that I think in a really creative way you're investing our own sector with, and the sense of dialogue and so many of the themes. They're things that are at the forefront of our minds as well. So we're just so excited to see where you literally and conceptually go next. It's been such a treat to learn all about your work.
Fantastic. Thanks for having us, Kirsten. It's been great to chat. And
Yeah.
Misha, it's been great to meet with you in the virtual space.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been great conversation, great questions. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.